What if I told you that right now, at this very moment, you could be breaking the law just by sitting down? Or that in some corner of America, there's a place where your choice of utensil while eating chicken could land you in legal trouble? That somewhere legislators sat in a room and decided the exact position your furniture can occupy, the temperature your beer must be, and whether or not you're allowed to combine pie with ice cream on Sundays. America is a land of laws. Lots of laws. So many laws that buried beneath the serious ones, the ones about taxes and traffic and not stealing things. There's a whole other layer, a strange, forgotten, often completely absurd layer that makes you wonder what exactly was happening when these got written. So, if you're ready, grab something comfortable to sit on, assuming it's not indoor furniture on an outdoor porch in Colorado, and let's take a tour through 50 of the strangest laws still on the books in the United States, starting with Alabama, where your choice of facial hair accessories in church might be more serious than you think. Alabama's fake mustache felony. Picture this. It's Sunday morning in Alabama, sometime in the early 20th century. You're sitting in church, trying to focus on the sermon, when the guy in front of you turns around. He's wearing a ridiculous fake mustache. One of those thick, curly ones that looks like it was borrowed from a vaudeville show. And despite your best efforts, you start laughing. The whole pew starts laughing. The preacher stops mid-sentence. Now, in most places, this would just be an awkward moment. But in Alabama, according to old statute books, wearing a fake mustache in church that causes laughter could technically land you in legal trouble. The law was apparently designed to maintain decorum during religious services, which makes sense if you think about how seriously people took church back then. No funny business, no distractions, and certainly no comedy props glued to your upper lip. The exact origins of this law are murky, lost somewhere in the dusty archives of Alabama's legislative history. Some say it was aimed at troublemakers who'd wear disguises to mock the congregation. Others think it was just part of a broader effort to keep churches solemn and respectful. Either way, the law stuck around, at least on paper, long after fake mustaches stopped being anyone's idea of a good prank. Is it enforced today? Almost certainly not. You could probably walk into any church in Alabama wearing a Groucho Marx costume, and the worst you'd get is some confused looks and maybe a gentle escort to the exit. But the law remains, a strange little footnote in the great book of American legal oddities. A reminder that someone, somewhere, once thought facial hair pranks were enough of a problem to legislate against. But Alabama is not alone in having strange rules about personal conduct in specific places. Up north in Alaska, there's another law that sounds equally ridiculous, though this one actually makes a bit more sense when you think about it. Alaska's drunk in a bar paradox. Alaska has a law that sounds like it was written by someone who had never actually been to a bar. You cannot be visibly drunk in a bar. Yes, you read that right. In the place where people go specifically to drink alcohol, being drunk is technically illegal. It's like banning swimming at a pool or sleeping in a hotel. The irony is thick enough to cut with a butter knife. This law exists under Alaska Statute Section 11.41.250, which prohibits public intoxication. And bars, as it turns out, count as public places. The statute was likely designed with good intentions, aimed at preventing the kind of fall-down, fight-starting, property-destroying drunkenness that can turn a quiet evening into a police matter. Alaska takes public safety seriously, especially in remote communities where medical help might be hours away. But the practical application is where things get weird. Bartenders are supposed to cut people off when they appear intoxicated. If someone's slurring words, stumbling, or otherwise showing obvious signs of being drunk, the bar staff can technically be held liable for continuing to serve them. And if that person gets too drunk while in the establishment, both the patron and potentially the bar itself could face legal consequences. The result is this bizarre dance where everyone pretends to be just slightly tipsy, not drunk, never drunk, just relaxed, loosened up, socially lubricated. Call it whatever you want, just don't call it drunk while you're still inside the bar. Step outside, though, and you'd better hope you can walk a straight line, because Alaska's law enforcement doesn't mess around with public intoxication. It's the kind of law that makes perfect sense from a safety perspective, but creates an absurd situation in practice. And speaking of absurd situations involving animals and unlikely places, let's head down to the desert Southwest. Arizona's bathtub donkey ban. There are laws that make you wonder about the story behind them. And then there's Arizona's prohibition against donkeys sleeping in bathtubs. This isn't speculation or urban legend. It's a real ordinance, reportedly still on the books. And yes, there's allegedly a story behind it. Legend has it that back in the 1920s, a merchant in Arizona owned a donkey that had a peculiar habit. The donkey enjoyed lounging in the merchant's bathtub, which sat out in the yard. One day, a local dam broke, causing a flash flood. The bathtub, with the donkey still in it, was swept downstream. The donkey floated along in its porcelain vessel, eventually coming to rest miles away, completely unharmed but very confused. The incident caused enough of a stir that local officials decided to address the root cause. Not the dam breaking, not the flood preparedness. No, they went after the real problem. Donkeys in bathtubs. Thus, a law was born, banning the practice of allowing your donkey to sleep in a bathtub. Now, is this story completely true? It's hard to say. It's been repeated so many times that it's achieved the status of local folklore, and several sources cite it as fact, though tracking down the original ordinance number proves surprisingly difficult. But whether the law is actively enforced or just a colorful remnant of Arizona's territorial days, it serves as a perfect example of how specific American legislation can get. The image alone is worth considering. A donkey peacefully snoozing in a clawfoot tub, unaware that it's committing a minor legal infraction. It's the kind of mental picture that makes you smile despite yourself. And it raises an important question. How many donkey in bathtub incidents does it take before lawmakers decide intervention is necessary? But if you think animal-related laws are strange, wait until you hear about the state that made mispronunciation a legal offense. Arkansas's pronunciation police. Say it with me now. Arkansas, not Arkansas, not Arkansas, Arkansas. Get it wrong in Arkansas and you're technically breaking the law. This isn't folklore or exaggeration. Arkansas Code 1-4-105, passed in 1981, officially establishes the correct pronunciation of the state's name. It even includes phonetic spelling and declares that anyone who mispronounces it is breaking state law. The resolution came about because apparently people were butchering the name constantly. Tourists, news anchors, even other Americans would say, Arkansas, with the same pronunciation pattern as Kansas, and it drove Arkansans absolutely crazy. So the state legislature did what any reasonable government would do. They legislated pronunciation. The law is delightfully specific. It describes the proper pronunciation and even acknowledges the state's historical background, explaining that Arkansas comes from a French interpretation of a Native American word. The final S is silent because French. The emphasis is on the first syllable because that's just how it's done. There's no room for interpretation, no regional variations allowed. It's Arkansas, and that's final. Is anyone actually prosecuted for mispronunciation? Of course not. The law is more symbolic than practical, a statement of state pride rather than an enforceable statute. But it exists officially and legally, which means that technically, every time someone says Arkansas, they're committing a minor offense against the state of Arkansas. The dedication to linguistic correctness is almost admirable. In a country where state names get mangled constantly, Arkansas decided to draw a line in the sand. Or perhaps more accurately, to draw a line in the pronunciation guide. And honestly, after hearing it mispronounced for the 100th time, you might want a law too. Speaking of personal frustrations that became legislation, California has some thoughts about appropriate driving attire. California's House Coat Highway Code. California, land of sunshine, Hollywood dreams, and apparently very specific fashion regulations for drivers. According to ordinances that have been cited for decades, women are not allowed to drive a car while wearing a house coat. Not a bathrobe, specifically a house coat. Those loose, casual garments that your grandmother might have worn while making breakfast in the 1950s. The reasoning behind this supposed law, if it ever truly existed as enforceable statute, probably had something to do with safety. Housecoats are loose and flowing. They could potentially catch on pedals or gear shifts. A dangling sleeve might interfere with steering. And let's be honest, if you're still wearing your housecoat, you probably haven't had coffee yet, which seems like the real safety hazard. But here's where things get murky. Unlike some of the other laws we've discussed, this one is extremely difficult to verify. No one can seem to find an actual statute number. It appears in countless lists of weird laws, but tracking down the original legislation is nearly impossible. It might be a real law that's since been repealed. It might be a city ordinance that got exaggerated into state law status, or it might be complete fiction that's been repeated so many times everyone assumes it's true. What we do know is that California has no shortage of actual traffic laws. The vehicle code is thick enough to stop a bullet, and somewhere in those thousands of pages, there might have once been a line about appropriate attire for drivers, or there might not have been. The uncertainty is part of the charm. Either way, the image of a California Highway Patrol officer pulling someone over and saying, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the housecoat," is too good not to appreciate. It speaks to an era when people actually wore housecoats, when gender-specific laws didn't raise immediate red flags, and when legislators apparently had time to worry about what people wore while driving. But California's not alone in having oddly specific property regulations. Colorado's furniture placement laws, welcome to Colorado, where you can climb a mountain without a permit, but you cannot put your couch on the porch. Well, technically, you can put a couch on a porch, but only if it's outdoor furniture. Indoor furniture on outdoor porches is banned in some Colorado municipalities, and the enforcement is surprisingly real. This law primarily exists in college towns and residential areas where property standards are strictly maintained. The reasoning is actually pretty straightforward. Indoor furniture isn't designed to withstand weather. Rain, snow, and UV exposure turn that fabric sofa into a moldy, faded eyesore faster than you can say student housing. What starts as a convenient extra seating area becomes a neighborhood blight. Local ordinances in places like Boulder and Fort Collins specifically prohibit using indoor furniture for outdoor purposes. Code enforcement officers can and do issue citations for violations. The fines aren't usually severe, but they're real enough to get people's attention. And honestly, if you've ever seen an upholstered armchair after a Colorado winter, covered in snow and sprouting mildew, you understand why the law exists. The rule also serves another purpose. It's a proxy for property maintenance standards. If you're putting your living room furniture on the porch, there's a good chance other aspects of the property might not be up to code either. It's a visible indicator that the residents might not be taking care of the place, which affects property values and neighborhood aesthetics. Of course, the law creates some gray areas. What exactly constitutes indoor versus outdoor furniture? If you weatherproof a chair, does it become legal? What about furniture that could go either way, like certain types of wooden pieces? These questions have probably kept more than one city council meeting running late, but the spirit of the law is clear. Keep your crusty couch inside where it belongs. And if you need porch seating, invest in actual outdoor furniture. It's not the most exciting legislation, but it's definitely enforced. Unlike Connecticut, which tests its vegetables with disturbing seriousness, Connecticut's bouncing pickle law Connecticut takes its pickles seriously, deadly seriously. According to state food regulations dating back to 1948, a pickle is not legally a pickle unless it bounces. This isn't metaphorical. There's an actual bounce test. If your pickle doesn't bounce when dropped from a height of 1 foot, it's not fit for sale. The law emerged from a real incident involving two con men who sold cucumbers that they'd soaked in brine but not properly fermented. The resulting pickles were soft, mushy, and basically just wet cucumbers. When food inspectors investigated, they reportedly tested the pickles by dropping them. Real pickles, properly fermented and cured, develop enough internal structure to bounce. Fake pickles go splat. The test became official. Connecticut's Food and Drug Commissioners adopted the bounce test as a legitimate measure of pickle quality. The logic is actually sound. Proper fermentation creates textural changes in the cucumber. A good pickle should have snap, crispness, a certain structural integrity. A pickle that falls apart on impact hasn't been properly processed and might not be safe to eat. To this day, the bounce test remains part of Connecticut's food safety standards. It's not enforced with the same rigor as, say, restaurant sanitation grades, but pickle manufacturers know about it. And every so often, someone at a farmer's market or food festival will reference the law, drop a pickle, and watch it bounce to prove their authenticity. It's wonderfully absurd and perfectly practical at the same time. Only in America could food safety standards involve bounce tests. Only in Connecticut would they make it official state policy. The image of stern-faced inspectors in white coats, solemnly dropping pickles and measuring their bounce height, is too perfect not to love. And while Connecticut worries about pickle physics, Delaware has some very specific rules about what you can and cannot say in church. Delaware's whispering ban. Delaware, the first state, wants you to speak up in church. According to old statutes that may or may not still be technically on the books, whispering in church is prohibited. Not talking loudly, not disrupting the service, specifically whispering. If you've got something to say during services, apparently Delaware wants you to say it loud enough for everyone to hear. The logic behind this law, if there ever was any, probably had to do with the perception of respect. Whispering during a service seems sneaky, conspiratorial, disrespectful. If you're going to talk during church, at least have the decency to own it. Make it a proper disruption instead of this passive-aggressive murmuring that distracts everyone within 10 feet. Or perhaps the law targeted gossip specifically. Church was, and in many places still is, a prime location for social information exchange. People would whisper about scandals, spread rumors, engage in all manner of sotto voce character assassination while pretending to pay attention to the sermon. Maybe Delaware legislators got tired of it and decided to make whispering itself the offense. The enforcement mechanism is unclear. Did ushers patrol the pews, listening for whispers? Were there designated whisper spotters? How would you even prove someone was whispering as opposed to just breathing heavily? These are questions that probably never got answered because the law was likely never seriously enforced even when it was new. But it exists, at least in the historical record, as yet another example of American legislation trying to regulate social behavior in oddly specific ways. The image of someone being dragged out of church for whispering "nice hat" to their neighbor is absurd enough to make you smile. Which brings us to Florida, where the absurdity reaches new heights, or rather, new altitudes. Florida's Sunday parachute ban, Florida, America's strangest state, has a law that perfectly captures its particular brand of weirdness. Unmarried women are prohibited from parachuting on Sundays, not married women, not men of any marital status, specifically unmarried women, and specifically on Sundays. Every other day of the week? Parachute away. But Sunday? That's the Lord's Day, and the Lord apparently has opinions about single ladies skydiving. The supposed reasoning behind this law, if it was ever real, Probably ties back to blue laws, those old regulations designed to enforce religious observance and moral behavior on Sundays. Many states had laws prohibiting certain activities on Sundays, from shopping to entertainment to apparently recreational parachuting if you're female and unmarried. But why specifically unmarried women? Your guess is as good as anyone's. Maybe there was concern about women meeting men at parachuting events. Maybe there was some outdated notion that married women were more responsible and therefore safer parachutists. Maybe someone just really hated the idea of single women having fun on Sundays. The reasoning is lost to time, buried under decades of accumulated Florida weirdness. Tracking down verification of this law proves difficult. It appears on countless lists of strange legislation, but finding an actual statute number is nearly impossible. It might have been a local ordinance that got exaggerated, it might have been repealed decades ago, or it might never have existed at all. Just another piece of Florida folklore that sounds too perfectly Florida to question. What we know for certain is that no one is enforcing it. Unmarried women parachute in Florida every Sunday without legal consequences. But the legend persists, a perfect distillation of America's complicated relationship with gender, religion, and completely arbitrary rulemaking. And speaking of arbitrary food rules, Georgia has some very specific opinions about fried chicken etiquette. Georgia's fork-free fried chicken law, Gainesville, Georgia, takes its title as the poultry capital of the world seriously. So seriously, in fact, that eating fried chicken with a fork within city limits is technically illegal. This isn't urban legend. City code actually addresses proper fried chicken consumption, and hands are the legally mandated utensil. The ordinance was passed in 1961, partly as a publicity stunt to promote Gainesville's status as a major chicken producer, and partly because someone apparently felt very strongly about fried chicken authenticity. Real fried chicken, the thinking goes, should be eaten with your hands. Using a fork is pretentious, inauthentic, possibly even disrespectful to the proud tradition of Southern fried chicken. The law got tested in 1981 when a visitor was arrested for eating fried chicken with a fork at a festival. The arrest was staged as a publicity stunt, and the charges were dropped after the visitor apologized and agreed to eat properly. But the media attention was real, cementing Gainesville's reputation as a town that doesn't mess around when it comes to poultry etiquette. Is it enforced today? Not seriously. You can walk into any restaurant in Gainesville and request a fork for your chicken without fear of arrest. But locals remember the law, and it remains a point of civic pride. Tour guides mention it, restaurants joke about it. It's become part of the city's identity, a quirky bit of legal trivia that gets people talking about Gainesville and, by extension, buying their chicken. The underlying message is clear. Fried chicken is meant to be a hands-on experience. The crispy coating, the tender meat, the act of picking up a drumstick and biting in. Using a fork creates distance, literally and figuratively, between you and your food. And in Gainesville, they don't tolerate that kind of emotional barrier when it comes to their primary industry. But Georgia's not alone in having strange rules about what you can and cannot do with everyday objects. Hawaii's ear coin prohibition. Hawaii has a law that sounds like it was specifically designed to annoy magicians and party trick enthusiasts. You cannot place coins in your ears, not quarters, not pennies. No coins of any denomination are permitted in any ear, under any circumstances. Break this law and you could theoretically face legal consequences, though what those consequences might be remains unclear. The origin of this law is mysterious. Some sources claim it was designed to prevent people from counterfeiting coins by creating molds using ear-shaped containers. Others suggest it was meant to stop a specific scam, where people would pretend to pull coins from behind children's ears, potentially traumatizing the youth or creating false expectations about spontaneous money generation. Neither explanation makes much sense. A more plausible theory is that the law targeted a specific hygiene concern. Putting coins in ears is gross. Coins are incredibly dirty, covered in bacteria, pass through countless hands. Sticking them in ears could cause infections, hearing damage, or require expensive medical interventions to remove stuck currency. Perhaps Hawaii's legislators decided to head off the problem before it became an epidemic. Or maybe, and this seems most likely, the law never really existed in any enforceable form. It shows up on lists of weird laws, but tracking down an actual statute proves frustratingly difficult. It might be based on a misinterpreted ordinance about something else entirely. It might be complete fiction that's been repeated enough times to achieve truthiness. Regardless, the mental image is strong enough to carry the story. Someone, somewhere in Hawaii, allegedly felt strongly enough about ear coin placement to make it illegal. And that's beautiful in its absurdity. But Hawaii's quirky prohibition pales in comparison to Idaho's exception for one of humanity's oldest taboos. Idaho's survival cannibalism exception, Idaho Code 18-5003, makes something very clear. Cannibalism is illegal in Idaho. You cannot eat human flesh. This seems obvious, the kind of thing that shouldn't need to be spelled out in legislation. But Idaho felt it necessary to put it in writing. And here's where it gets interesting. They included an exception. Cannibalism is illegal in Idaho unless it's necessary for survival. If you're trapped on a mountain, lost in the wilderness, facing certain death from starvation, and someone in your party dies from natural causes, Idaho law technically permits you to consume their remains to stay alive. It's the Donner Party Clause, essentially, codified into modern law. The statute was added relatively recently, in 2011, after several states began examining gaps in their criminal codes. Idaho discovered they didn't actually have a law specifically prohibiting cannibalism. Murder was covered, desecration of remains was covered, but eating human flesh wasn't explicitly banned, so they fixed it, while acknowledging that extreme survival situations exist. The survival exception is actually consistent with broader legal principles. Necessity can serve as a defense for many otherwise illegal actions. If you break into a cabin to escape a blizzard, that's technically trespassing, but necessity provides a defense. The same logic applies here. If eating deceased human flesh is literally the only way to avoid your own death, the law acknowledges that's a different situation than cannibalism for any other reason. Will this law ever be tested in Idaho courts? Probably not. Extreme survival cannibalism situations are rare, and when they do occur, prosecution is even rarer. But the law exists, carefully worded, acknowledging both the taboo and the terrible reality that sometimes survival requires unthinkable choices. And compared to that grim necessity, Illinois' rules about bicycle tricks seem refreshingly lighthearted. Illinois' no-trick cycling law. Illinois has a law that sounds like it was specifically written to stop teenagers from showing off. No fancy bicycle tricks on public streets. No wheelies. No riding with hands off the handlebars. No standing on the seat. Keep both hands on the grips, both feet on the pedals, and maintain proper cycling posture at all times. The law exists under Illinois Vehicle Code, which treats bicycles as vehicles subject to traffic regulations. The no tricks rule is part of broader safety standards designed to reduce accidents. Performing stunts on a bicycle increases the risk of crashes, and when those crashes happen on public roads, they can involve cars, pedestrians, or other cyclists. The logic is sound even if the enforcement is spotty. A teenager popping a wheelie down Main Street might technically be breaking the law, but most police officers have better things to do than write tickets for bicycle showboating. Unless the tricks are genuinely dangerous or causing traffic problems, enforcement tends to be limited to warnings. But the law does get enforced in certain contexts. If a cyclist causes an accident while performing tricks, the violation can affect insurance claims and liability determinations. If someone's injured because a cyclist was riding one-handed or standing on pedals, that illegal trick becomes relevant evidence. The law might not be actively policed, but it exists in the background, ready to be applied when necessary. There's also something almost quaint about the law. It harkens back to an era when bicycles were the primary concern in traffic safety, before cars dominated every conversation. When legislators sat down to write rules about street safety, they thought carefully about bicycle behavior. No tricks, no showing off, just sensible, safe cycling. And speaking of quaint beverage laws, Indiana has some very specific thoughts about beer temperature. Indiana's warm beer mandate. Indiana had one of America's strangest alcohol laws until 2018. Cold beer could not be sold in grocery stores. Warm beer, absolutely. Room temperature, 6-packs, go for it. But if you wanted cold beer, you had to buy it from a liquor store. The law created a bizarre situation where the temperature of your beverage determined where you could legally purchase it. The reasoning behind this law was pure politics and business protection. Liquor stores lobbied hard to maintain their monopoly on cold beer sales. Their argument was that selling cold beer in grocery stores would make it too convenient, too accessible, potentially increasing alcohol abuse. The real motivation, of course, was protecting their market share. Liquor stores didn't want competition. For decades, Hoosiers dealt with this absurdity. If you wanted cold beer for a barbecue, you made a separate trip to the liquor store. If you wanted warm beer, you could grab it at the grocery store alongside your chips and buns. The law didn't prevent beer sales, it just made them inconvenient in the most arbitrary way possible. In 2018, the law finally changed. Governor Eric Holcomb signed legislation allowing Sunday alcohol sales, and the cold beer provision got swept up in the reform. Grocery stores could finally sell cold beer. Indiana joined the rest of America in allowing temperature-appropriate beverage retail. But for years before that, Indiana stood alone in its dedication to warm beer legislation. It was protectionism dressed up as public safety, convenience regulated by temperature, and capitalism at its most absurd. The law's repeal was celebrated by grocery stores and customers alike, mourned only by liquor store owners who'd grown comfortable with their protected status. And from beer temperature to ice cream access, Iowa has its own story about restricted frozen treats. Iowa's ice cream truck ban in Indianola. Indianola, Iowa, population about 16,000, has banned ice cream trucks from operating within city limits. No jingling music, no colorful vehicles cruising residential streets, no ice cream trucks. The ordinance has been in place for years, and unlike many of the laws on this list, it's actually enforced. The reasoning behind the ban centers on safety and noise concerns. City officials argued that ice cream trucks create hazards by attracting children who run into streets without looking. The trucks themselves move slowly through neighborhoods, stopping frequently, creating traffic congestion. And the music, that eternally looping melody, drives residents slowly insane during summer months. Local ice cream truck operators fought the ban, arguing it unfairly targeted their businesses. They pointed out that children run into streets for lots of reasons, not just ice cream. They noted that the trucks move slowly specifically because of safety concerns. And as for the music, well, that's just part of the tradition. Banning ice cream trucks because the music is annoying is like banning birds because they chirp too early. The city council disagreed. The ban stayed in place. Indianola children grow up without the ice cream truck experience, that quintessentially American summer ritual of hearing distant music, begging parents for money, and running outside to flag down frozen treats. Instead, they go to ice cream shops or buy their treats at stores like children in some dystopian future where mobile desserts are forbidden. The ban makes Indianola unique, a small Iowa town taking a stand against a beloved American institution. And honestly, after years of that looping turkey in the straw melody, you might understand why they did it. Kansas's Sunday dessert restrictions. Topeka, Kansas apparently drew a very specific line in the sand when it came to Sunday desserts. You can have cherry pie, you can have ice cream, but you cannot, under any circumstances, have cherry pie with ice cream on top. No pie a la mode on Sundays. The rest of the week, go wild. But the Lord's Day requires your desserts to remain separate. This law falls into that category of blue laws, those old Sunday restrictions designed to enforce religious observance and moral behavior. Many states had laws prohibiting various activities on Sundays, from shopping to entertainment to apparently combining baked goods with dairy products. The reasoning, if there ever was any coherent reasoning, probably had something to do with excess and indulgence. Plain pie is acceptable, ice cream is acceptable, but combining them? That's too much pleasure for the Sabbath. The law was likely never seriously enforced, even when it was new. Imagine a police officer writing a citation because someone added a scoop of vanilla to their slice of pie. The paperwork alone would be absurd. But the law existed, at least according to local ordinance books, creating this wonderfully specific restriction that makes you wonder about the discussion that led to it. Did someone propose banning all desserts on Sunday? Did they compromise by allowing desserts but prohibiting combinations? Who fought for the right to keep pie separate from ice cream? The law has almost certainly been repealed or simply fallen into disuse. Modern Topeka residents can enjoy their pie a la mode any day of the week without legal consequences. But for years, technically speaking, Sunday pie came with a very specific restriction. And if you think swearing off dessert combinations is odd, Kentucky requires its officials to swear off something far more violent. Kentucky's anti-dueling oath before taking office in Kentucky. All state officials must swear an oath that they have never participated in a duel. Not that they won't duel in the future, that they have never dueled in the past. It's written right into the Kentucky Constitution, Section 228. A relic from an era when settling disputes with pistols at dawn was common enough to require legislative attention. The anti-dueling oath was added to Kentucky's Constitution in 1850 during a period when dueling was still practiced, but increasingly frowned upon. Several prominent politicians and judges had died in duels, and states were trying to crack down on the practice. Simply making dueling illegal wasn't enough. They wanted to prevent duelists from holding public office entirely. The oath remains in place today. Every elected official, every judge, every state employee who takes an oath of office must swear they've never participated in a duel. The language is archaic, referencing a challenge or acceptance of a challenge to fight a duel, and extending to anyone who acted as a second in a duel. It's thorough. If you've been anywhere near a formal duel, Kentucky doesn't want you in office. This creates an amusing historical thought experiment. Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, two of America's most famous duelists, would be constitutionally barred from holding office in Kentucky. Hamilton's legacy as a founding father wouldn't matter. Burr's vice presidency wouldn't count. They dueled, and Kentucky's constitution is very clear on this issue. Is the oath enforced? Well, duels are extremely rare in modern America, so it's largely moot. But the oath remains, recited by every new Kentucky official, a strange reminder of a time when personal honor was defended with firearms. And speaking of using violence inappropriately, Louisiana has some very specific rules about bear-based entertainment. Louisiana's bear wrestling ban. Louisiana takes a firm stance on a very specific form of entertainment. You cannot wrestle bears. Not in bars, not at festivals, not for money, not for fun. Bear wrestling is comprehensively banned under Louisiana law, and the prohibition is actually enforced when violations occur. The law emerged from a real problem. In the mid-20th century, bear wrestling was a legitimate, if disturbing, form of entertainment in parts of the rural South. Promoters would travel with captive bears, usually declawed and defanged, and set up matches where patrons could pay to wrestle the animal. The bears were often drugged or malnourished to make them less dangerous. It was cruel, exploitative, and surprisingly popular. Louisiana banned the practice in 1996, making it illegal to promote, organize, or participate in bear wrestling exhibitions. The law specifically prohibits using bears for fighting or wrestling entertainment and includes penalties for violations. Several other southern states passed similar bans around the same time, responding to animal welfare concerns and the general realization that wrestling bears probably wasn't the best use of anyone's time. The ban wasn't just symbolic, there were still active bear wrestling operations when the law passed. Promoters had to shut down or move to states without restrictions. The bears themselves were either retired to sanctuaries or, sadly, remained in captivity under different circumstances. Enforcement continues today. If someone tried to set up a bear wrestling match in Louisiana, they'd face genuine legal consequences. The fact that such a law was necessary says something about human creativity in finding questionable entertainment. Someone looked at a bear and thought, I should wrestle that for money. Many other people apparently agreed it was worth watching. Louisiana eventually decided it wasn't worth allowing. And while bear wrestling might be banned, Maine has equally strict rules about a much more common activity, dancing. Maine's dancing permit requirement. In Maine, if you want to allow dancing in your establishment that serves alcohol, you need a special permit, not just a liquor license, not just a business permit, a specific, separate dancing permit. The law treats dancing as a distinct activity requiring state oversight and approval, separate from simply serving drinks or playing music. The regulation exists under Maine's liquor licensing laws, which give municipalities control over what activities occur in establishments that serve alcohol. The reasoning is ostensibly about crowd control and safety. Dancing leads to more movement, more people in tight spaces, more potential for accidents or incidents. By requiring a separate permit, the state ensures that establishments have adequate space, proper exits, and appropriate insurance before allowing patrons to dance. In practice, the law creates bureaucratic absurdity. Bar owners must apply for dancing permits, pay additional fees, and meet specific requirements. If they want live music but not dancing, that's one set of rules. If they want dancing, that's a different, more restrictive set. Some establishments obtain licenses for recorded music only, specifically to avoid the dancing permit requirements. The law has been challenged multiple times by bar owners who argue it's outdated and unnecessarily restrictive. They point out that people will dance regardless of whether the establishment has a permit. Making it illegal doesn't stop it from happening. It just creates more paperwork and more potential violations. Maine has modified the law somewhat over the years, but the basic permit requirement remains. There's something wonderfully footloose about the whole situation. Maine, the pine tree state, where the moose outnumber the people, requires government permission to dance in bars. It's overly cautious bureaucracy at its finest, treating dancing as such a potentially dangerous activity that it requires special state oversight. And if dancing needs permits, Maryland believes swearing needs enforcement. Maryland's highway profanity prohibition, Rockville, Maryland, takes the concept of road rage literally. Swearing on highways within city limits is illegal. Not just threatening language, not just directed harassment. Any profanity, any curse word, any blue language on public roads violates city ordinance and could result in a citation. The law, codified in Rockville City Code Section 13-53, prohibits profane language in public places, with highways specifically mentioned. The ordinance dates back decades, part of broader public decency laws that attempted to regulate behavior in shared spaces. The idea was that streets and highways are communal areas where people of all ages might be present, and profanity violates standards of public decorum. Enforcement is sporadic but real. Police officers can issue citations for profanity violations, though they typically do so in conjunction with other offenses. If someone's causing a disturbance and swearing, the profanity charge gets added. If someone's screaming obscenities at other drivers, creating a dangerous situation, the curse words themselves become part of the violation. It's rarely enforced in isolation, but it's available as an additional charge when needed. The law raises obvious First Amendment concerns. Language, even offensive language, is generally protected speech, but courts have upheld certain restrictions on profanity in public places, particularly when that profanity might incite violence or disturb the peace. Rockville's law exists in this gray area, technically on the books, occasionally enforced, and constantly debated. The practical result is that Rockville drivers must keep their road rage verbal expressions clean. No matter how badly someone cuts you off, no matter how frustrating the traffic, you must maintain family-friendly language or risk a citation. It's civility enforced by law, profanity policed by ordinance. And if Maryland regulates language, Massachusetts has some very specific rules about primate transportation. Massachusetts's gorilla passenger law. Massachusetts law is very clear on this point. No gorillas in the backseat of cars. You can have a dog in the backseat. You can have a cat, a child, a pile of groceries. But if you have a gorilla, it must ride in the front seat. Or more accurately, it shouldn't be in your car at all. But if it must be, the backseat is specifically prohibited. This law supposedly exists, though tracking down the exact statute proves difficult. It appears on numerous lists of weird laws, always with the same phrasing about backseat gorillas. The reasoning, according to various sources, has something to do with driver distraction and safety. A gorilla in the back seat could potentially grab the driver or cause panic. A gorilla in the front seat is visible, contained, less likely to cause surprise disruption. The logic is wonderfully absurd. If the concern is driver safety, why allow gorillas in cars at all? Adult gorillas can weigh 400 pounds and possess strength that dwarfs human capability. Having one in the passenger seat seems marginally safer than having one in the back seat, but both scenarios are fundamentally terrible ideas. This isn't a question of seat positioning. It's a question of why there's a gorilla in your vehicle in the first place. The law, if it truly exists, probably emerged from traveling circus or zoo transport situations. In the early to mid 20th century, when regulations about exotic animal transport were less comprehensive, someone probably did drive around with a gorilla in their car. Massachusetts apparently felt the need to specify proper gorilla seating arrangements, rather than banning the practice entirely. Modern Massachusetts residents don't need to worry much about this law. Gorilla ownership is heavily regulated, and transporting them requires specialized vehicles and permits. But theoretically, if you did have a gorilla in Massachusetts, keep it out of the back seat. And speaking of automotive restrictions, Michigan has some very specific rules about when you can buy cars. Michigan's Sunday car sales ban. Michigan has a law that sounds like it was written specifically to annoy car salespeople. No vehicle sales on Sundays. Car dealerships must close. You can browse online. You can window shop. But you cannot complete a purchase transaction for a motor vehicle on Sunday in Michigan. The law has been on the books for decades and remains actively enforced. The prohibition exists under Michigan's Motor Vehicle Sales Finance Act, which regulates car dealership operations. The Sunday closure requirement was originally part of broader blue laws designed to ensure a day of rest and religious observance. Auto dealerships argued that being open 7 days a week created unfair pressure on employees and led to competitive disadvantages for dealers who wanted to close on Sundays. Interestingly, many car dealers support this law. It guarantees them a day off without losing competitive ground. If everyone must close on Sundays, no dealer loses sales to competitors who stay open. It levels the playing field by requiring everyone to stop simultaneously. Some dealership associations have actively fought against repeal efforts, preferring the mandated closure. The law does create some inconvenience for consumers who work Monday through Saturday and would prefer to car shop on Sundays. But it also means dealership employees get guaranteed time off, which in the high pressure world of car sales is relatively rare. Michigan values that guaranteed rest day enough to maintain the prohibition. There are exceptions and workarounds. Online sales can be initiated on Sundays, with the actual transaction completed later. Private party sales aren't covered by the law, and some dealers use Sunday for service appointments rather than sales. But the basic rule remains: no buying or selling cars from dealerships on Sundays in Michigan. And while Michigan protects its car dealers' rest day, Minnesota has some very specific concerns about pig-based entertainment. Minnesota's greased pig contest ban. Minnesota has outlawed greased pig contests, and honestly, it's probably for the best. For those unfamiliar with this particular form of rural entertainment, greased pig contests involved coating a pig in grease or oil and then having contestants chase it around trying to catch it. The pig, understandably terrified and unable to be easily grabbed, would slip away repeatedly while crowds laughed and contestants tumbled around. The practice was common at county fairs and festivals throughout rural America. It was considered family-friendly entertainment, a harmless bit of fun that showcased agility and determination. Never mind that the pig was experiencing extreme stress. Never mind that people frequently got injured chasing slippery livestock. It was tradition, and tradition was enough justification. Minnesota banned the practice under its animal welfare statutes, which prohibit treating animals in ways that cause unnecessary suffering or distress. Coating a pig in grease and forcing it to flee from screaming humans definitely qualifies. The law passed with relatively little controversy once people actually thought about what was happening from the pig's perspective. Similar bans exist in several other states, part of a broader shift toward recognizing that animal welfare matters even in entertainment contexts. What previous generations considered harmless fun is now recognized as stressful and potentially harmful for the animals involved. Minnesota decided that whatever entertainment value greased pig contests provided wasn't worth the animal welfare concerns. The ban means Minnesota fairs and festivals must find other forms of entertainment. Plenty of options exist that don't involve terrified livestock. And Minnesotans seem to have adapted just fine to a world without greased pig contests. Though if you think chasing pigs is disruptive, Mississippi has some very specific rules about disturbing church services. Mississippi's Church Service Protection Law, Mississippi law, makes it a crime to willfully disturb any assembly of people met for religious worship. This isn't about noise complaints or parking violations. This is a specific criminal statute protecting church services from disruption, codified in Mississippi Code Section 97-35-17. The law prohibits disrupting religious services through noise, profanity, rude behavior, or any other means of disturbance. Violations can result in fines or even jail time, depending on the severity of the disruption. The statute has been on the books in various forms for over a century, reflecting the state's cultural emphasis on religion and church attendance. Enforcement happens more often than you might expect. People who show up to church services intoxicated and cause disturbances can be arrested under this statute. Protesters who disrupt services, even on public sidewalks outside churches, have been cited. The law gives law enforcement a specific tool for addressing disruptions that might not clearly fall under general disturbing the peace statutes. The law raises some First Amendment concerns about free speech and protest rights, particularly when enforcement extends to sidewalks outside church buildings. Courts have generally upheld the statute as applied to disruptions inside services, but have been more skeptical about enforcement in public spaces outside churches. The balance between religious freedom and free speech creates ongoing legal discussions. In practice, the law mostly affects people who show up to services intending to cause problems. Ordinary noise from traffic or nearby businesses doesn't trigger enforcement, but if you deliberately set out to disrupt a religious service in Mississippi, you're committing a specific crime with specific penalties. It's protection for religious observance written directly into criminal code. And speaking of livestock-related laws, Missouri has some very specific rules about wandering bulls. Missouri's bull castration statute. Missouri has a law that's both practical and slightly horrifying. If your bull gets loose and wanders around for more than 3 days, authorities can castrate it, not impound it, not fine you, castrate it. The law exists as a livestock control measure, addressing the very real problem of roaming bulls disrupting agriculture and creating safety hazards. The statute, found in Missouri, Revised Statutes Chapter 270, gives county officials authority to deal with livestock that repeatedly escapes and causes problems. Bulls specifically are addressed because of the unique risks they present. An adult bull can weigh over 2,000 pounds, can be aggressive, and can cause significant damage to property, other livestock, and potentially humans. The 3-day threshold is specific and intentional. If your bull gets out once and you retrieve it quickly, no problem. Livestock escapes happen. But if the bull remains at large for 3 days or more, that indicates either negligence on the owner's part or a bull that's particularly good at escaping. Either way, authorities need a mechanism to address the situation. Castration serves multiple purposes in this context. It makes the bull less aggressive and easier to handle. It reduces the animal's tendency to roam and escape, and it prevents the bull from breeding with other cattle, which could create unplanned livestock populations or genetic issues. It's a permanent solution to a recurring problem. Is this law actively enforced? In rural Missouri counties with significant cattle populations, yes. County officials have used this statute to address problem bulls that repeatedly escape and cause issues. The threat of castration also motivates owners to maintain better fencing and livestock management. Nobody wants their valuable breeding bull turned into a steer because of inadequate fence maintenance. And while Missouri manages its bulls carefully, Montana has some very specific concerns about sheep transportation. Montana's sheep chaperone requirement. Montana law requires that if you're transporting a sheep in your truck cab, the sheep must have a chaperone. Not just any passenger. Specifically, a chaperone. You cannot be alone in a truck cab with an unchaperoned sheep. This law supposedly exists to prevent inappropriate behavior with livestock, though explaining exactly what that means feels uncomfortable. The law appears in various compilations of weird state legislation, always with the same phrasing about truck cabs and chaperones. Tracking down the actual statute proves difficult, which suggests this might be one of those laws that's more legend than reality. But the story persists, repeated across multiple sources, becoming part of Montana's reputation for quirky rural legislation. If the law does exist, the reasoning presumably involves concerns about bestiality or livestock welfare. Montana takes agriculture seriously, and sheep represent significant economic value. Perhaps there were incidents where people transported sheep inappropriately, leading legislators to impose specific requirements, or perhaps the law emerged from misinterpreted language in other livestock transport regulations. The image created by this supposed law is irresistibly absurd. A rancher driving down a Montana highway with a sheep riding shotgun and another person in the middle seat serving as official chaperone to ensure nothing inappropriate happens between human and livestock. It's the kind of mental picture that makes you laugh, despite the uncomfortable implications. Whether real or urban legend, the Montana sheep chaperone law has achieved a kind of immortality through repetition. It appears on every list of weird state laws, always generating reactions of disbelief and amusement. And honestly, in a state where livestock outnumbers people, maybe specific transportation rules aren't that surprising. Speaking of geography-specific laws, Nebraska has some very particular concerns about driving off cliffs. Nebraska's non-existent mountain prohibition. Nebraska has a law stating that drivers cannot drive off mountain roads or cliffs. This seems reasonable until you remember one crucial fact. Nebraska doesn't have mountains. The entire state is plains. Rolling hills at best. The highest point in Nebraska is about 5,300 feet above sea level, and it's not anywhere near a cliff or mountain road in any dramatic sense. The law supposedly exists in Nebraska's traffic code, though finding the exact statute requires significant digging. The most likely explanation is that the law is part of model traffic legislation that Nebraska adopted wholesale, including provisions that don't apply to the state's geography. Many states use standardized traffic codes with slight modifications, and sometimes the modifications don't catch everything. The result is a law prohibiting something that's essentially impossible in Nebraska. You cannot drive off a mountain edge because there are no mountain edges to drive off. The law is preemptively protective, guarding against a hazard that doesn't exist within state borders. It's legislative caution taken to an absurd extreme. Or more cynically, it's a law that exists only in the imagination of people who compile weird law lists. The citation might be misinterpreted language from actual safety statutes. It might be a completely made-up law that's been repeated enough to seem true. The difficulty in verification suggests this is more legend than reality. But real or not, it's achieved mimetic status as one of Nebraska's stranger legal quirks. A state so flat you can watch your dog run away for 3 days has a law about mountain driving safety. It's perfectly Nebraska in its unnecessary practicality. And speaking of unnecessary prohibitions, Nevada has some very specific rules about sidewalk usage in Reno. Nevada's Reno sidewalk prohibition. In Reno, Nevada, sitting or lying on public sidewalks is illegal. Not sleeping, not camping, specifically sitting or lying down. You can stand on sidewalks, you can walk on sidewalks. But parking yourself on the pavement, even temporarily, violates city ordinance and can result in citation or arrest. The law exists under Reno Municipal Code and was passed in 2012 to address concerns about homelessness and pedestrian access. City officials argued that people sitting or lying on sidewalks blocked pedestrian traffic, created sanitation issues, and negatively impacted businesses. The ordinance was designed to keep sidewalks clear and accessible. Critics immediately pointed out the law's discriminatory impact. Who sits or lies on sidewalks? Primarily homeless individuals who have nowhere else to go. The law essentially criminalizes homelessness by making it illegal to exist in public spaces in certain positions. You can't afford housing, you can't sleep in parks, and now you can't even sit on sidewalks. The law tells people experiencing homelessness to be somewhere else without providing anywhere else to be. The ordinance has been challenged multiple times on constitutional grounds. Courts have generally been skeptical of laws that prohibit sitting or lying in public when no alternative spaces are provided. Some challenges have succeeded in limiting enforcement, while others have failed. The law remains on the books and is still enforced, though implementation varies depending on circumstances. Reno's sidewalk law exemplifies how cities use ordinances to address visible poverty without addressing poverty's underlying causes. Rather than providing services or housing, they pass laws that move the problem somewhere less visible. It's not solving homelessness, it's criminalizing the symptoms while ignoring the disease. And speaking of coastal regulations, New Hampshire has some very specific rules about nighttime seaweed collection. New Hampshire's seaweed collection ban. New Hampshire prohibits collecting seaweed from beaches at night. During the day, collect away. Fill your buckets with marine vegetation to your heart's content. But once the sun goes down, seaweed collection becomes illegal, punishable by fines and potentially more serious penalties for repeat offenders. The law exists under New Hampshire's Coastal Resource Management regulations. Seaweed, also called rockweed or kelp, depending on the variety, serves important ecological functions. It provides habitat for marine life, protects shorelines from erosion, and contributes to the overall health of coastal ecosystems. Unregulated harvesting can damage these systems, particularly if people take too much from single locations. The nighttime ban specifically addresses illegal commercial harvesting. Some people would collect seaweed under cover of darkness, taking far more than personal use amounts and selling it to cosmetics companies or fertilizer manufacturers. Nighttime enforcement is difficult, so the law creates a clear boundary. Any seaweed collection at night is automatically suspicious and illegal. There's also a practical safety element. New Hampshire's coast, while small, has rocky beaches and tidal areas that become dangerous at night. People collecting seaweed in darkness risk slipping on rocks, getting caught by tides, or becoming disoriented. The nighttime ban reduces these risks by pushing collection activities to daylight hours when hazards are visible. The law affects a relatively small number of people. Most New Hampshire residents aren't regularly harvesting seaweed, but for those who do collect it for gardening, cooking, or other purposes, the nighttime restriction is clear and enforced. Stay out of the ocean in darkness, or at least don't collect seaweed while you're there. And speaking of oddly specific prohibitions on common activities, New Jersey has some thoughts about men's hobbies during fishing season. New Jersey's knitting ban. During fishing season, New Jersey allegedly has a law stating that men cannot knit during fishing season, not women. Specifically men, and specifically during fishing season. The law supposedly prohibits this particular combination of gender, hobby, and timing, creating one of the most oddly specific legislative restrictions imaginable. Tracking down verification of this law proves nearly impossible. It appears on countless lists of weird state laws, always with the same phrasing about men, knitting, and fishing season. But finding an actual statute number, an enforcement record, or any official documentation remains elusive. This strongly suggests the law is either severely misinterpreted or completely fictional. If the law did exist, the reasoning would be completely baffling. Why would knitting be gender restricted? Why would fishing season matter? Is the concern that men who knit during fishing season aren't actually fishing? Are they distracting other fishermen with their needlework? The logic defies explanation, which is part of why the law has achieved such legendary status. The more likely explanation is that this law never existed at all. It might be based on misremembered language from old fishing regulations that mentions something else entirely. It might be complete fabrication that entered the weird law mythology and never left. The specificity makes it sound true, but the impossibility of verification suggests otherwise. Real or not, the image it creates is wonderfully absurd. A New Jersey game warden approaching a man peacefully knitting by a lake and informing him that his hobby violates state fishing season regulations. The man protesting that he's not even fishing, just enjoying nature while working on a scarf. The warden explaining that the combination of male gender, knitting needles, and fishing season creates a legal problem regardless of actual fishing activity. It's too ridiculous not to appreciate, even if it's entirely fictional. New Mexico's full anthem requirement. New Mexico takes its patriotic songs seriously. According to state law, if you're going to sing the national anthem or the state anthem at an official event, you must sing the entire thing. No abbreviated versions, no skipping verses, no medleys that jump from one anthem fragment to another. Start at the beginning, proceed through every verse, and finish at the end. Anything less is technically illegal. The law exists under New Mexico Statute Section 12-3-12, which addresses the proper use and performance of the state anthem. The legislation was passed to ensure that when anthems are performed at official state functions, they're treated with appropriate respect and dignity. Cutting verses or abbreviating the performance was seen as disrespectful to the symbols those songs represent. The practical application is interesting. Most people only know the first verse of the Star-Spangled Banner anyway. The national anthem has 4 verses, but performances almost universally include only the opening stanza. Does New Mexico require all 4 verses? The statute language focuses primarily on the state anthem, "O Fair New Mexico," which is considerably shorter and more manageable than the national anthem's full version. Enforcement is essentially non existent for casual performances. If you're singing along at a baseball game and only know one verse, no one's writing you a citation. But for official state ceremonies, performers are expected to deliver complete renditions. Music directors and event planners know about the requirement and plan accordingly. It's less about criminal enforcement and more about setting standards for state protocol. The law reflects New Mexico's fierce pride in its symbols and heritage. In a state with a complex cultural identity, where Native American, Hispanic, and Anglo traditions intersect, official symbols carry weight. Treating them with full respect means performing them completely, every verse, every time. And speaking of complete adherence to rules, New York has some very specific prohibitions about recreational activities involving projectiles. New York's anti-headball law, New York State penal law, includes provisions that make it illegal to throw balls at people's heads for fun. This isn't about accidental, errant throws during baseball games or basketball mishaps. This is specifically about the intentional act of throwing balls at heads as a form of entertainment or recreation. The law targets games and activities where hitting someone's head with a thrown object is the goal. The most obvious application is dodgeball, particularly older, more aggressive versions where headshots were not only allowed but encouraged. Schools and recreational programs have largely moved away from traditional dodgeball, partly because of injury concerns and partly because of legal liability issues. New York's law provides clear legal backing for those safety policies, but the prohibition extends beyond dodgeball. Any game or activity where the objective involves throwing projectiles at heads violates the statute. This could include certain carnival games, hazing rituals, or spontaneous let's throw things at each other activities that seem fun until someone gets hurt. The law gives prosecutors a specific tool for addressing these situations when they result in injuries. The statute exists within New York's broader assault and reckless endangerment laws. Intentionally hitting someone in the head with a thrown object can cause serious injury, from concussions to eye damage to worse. Even when participants consent to the activity, the state has an interest in preventing unnecessary injuries that might require medical intervention. Enforcement typically happens after someone gets hurt. If a dodgeball game results in a concussion and the game specifically allowed or encouraged headshots, that's when the law becomes relevant. It's less about policing everyday playground activities and more about providing legal recourse when supposedly fun games cause actual harm. And while New York restricts certain games, North Carolina has some very specific limits on a beloved pastime. North Carolina's bingo time restrictions. North Carolina loves bingo but believes in moderation. State law limits bingo games to no more than 5 hours per session, and organizations can only hold bingo sessions twice per week. No marathon bingo sessions, no daily games. 5 hours twice weekly, and that's it. The regulations are detailed in North Carolina General Statutes, Chapter 14, Article 37. The restrictions exist because bingo in North Carolina is heavily regulated as a form of gambling. Only certain nonprofit organizations can host bingo games, and they must follow strict rules about session length, frequency, and prize amounts. The time limit prevents bingo from becoming the kind of all-consuming gambling activity that casinos offer. 5 hours is long enough for a satisfying game night, but not so long that people lose track of time and money. The twice-weekly frequency limit serves a similar purpose. If organizations could host bingo every night, it would effectively create unlicensed gambling halls. Limiting sessions to 2 per week keeps bingo in the realm of occasional recreation rather than habitual gambling. It also prevents organizations from becoming overly dependent on bingo revenue, which could create perverse incentives. Enforcement is real. North Carolina's Alcohol Law Enforcement Division monitors bingo operations. Organizations that violate the time or frequency limits can lose their permits, face fines, or even criminal charges in serious cases. The state takes these regulations seriously because bingo occupies an unusual space in gambling law, permitted for charities but still considered risky enough to require careful control. The result is a very specific bingo culture in North Carolina. Players know that sessions will last up to 5 hours, so they plan accordingly. Organizations schedule their 2 weekly sessions strategically to maximize attendance, and everyone operates within these precise boundaries, turning a simple game into a carefully regulated activity. But if bingo has time limits, North Dakota has even stranger restrictions on food pairings. North Dakota's beer and pretzel prohibition. North Dakota supposedly has a law prohibiting the simultaneous serving of beer and pretzels. You can serve beer, you can serve pretzels, but serving them together in the same establishment at the same time allegedly violates state law. This restriction appears on numerous lists of weird state laws, always cited as a genuine North Dakota statute. The problem? Tracking down actual verification proves nearly impossible. No one can provide a statute number. No enforcement records exist. The law appears to be entirely mythical, one of those legal urban legends that gets repeated until everyone assumes it's true. North Dakota's actual alcohol regulations are extensive, covering licensing, sales hours, and serving practices. But nowhere do they mention pretzels specifically. The legend probably emerged from misinterpreted language in old liquor laws. Many states had regulations about providing free food in bars, concerned that establishments were giving away salty snacks to encourage more drinking. North Dakota might have had such a regulation at some point, and somewhere in the retelling it became beer and pretzels can't be served together, which is catchier than bars can't give away free salty snacks to promote alcohol sales. Or the law might be complete fiction, invented as a joke, and then repeated seriously by people who didn't realize it started as humor. Weird law lists often lack rigorous fact-checking, and the stranger something sounds, the more likely people are to repeat it without verification. Beer and pretzels prohibition is strange enough to seem believable, especially in the context of America's bizarre legal history. Real or not, it's achieved legendary status in North Dakota. Visitors ask about it, bartenders get questioned, and no one can definitively prove it exists, which somehow makes it more fascinating. Speaking of legal mysteries, Ohio has some very peculiar rules about Sunday crime prosecution that involve rivers. Ohio's Sunday crime exception. Ohio has an old legal principle that crimes committed on Sunday aren't prosecutable, except for offenses committed on navigable rivers. This sounds completely absurd, like someone started making up a law and then added random qualifiers. But it has historical roots in blue laws and jurisdictional complexities that made more sense in the 19th century than they do now. The Sunday exception came from the idea that Sundays were holy days when legal proceedings shouldn't occur. Some interpretations held that crimes committed on Sunday existed in a sort of legal gray area, committed on a day that stood outside normal legal time. This was never universally accepted or consistently enforced, but the principle appeared in various state statutes. The river exception relates to jurisdiction and federal authority. Navigable rivers often fall under federal jurisdiction or exist as boundaries between jurisdictions. Crimes on rivers might involve interstate commerce, federal waterways, or other complications that supersede state Sunday laws. The exception acknowledged that river crimes needed to be prosecutable regardless of when they occurred because of these jurisdictional complexities. In modern Ohio, this principle is essentially defunct. Crimes are prosecuted when they occur, regardless of the day of the week. Courts operate on regular schedules that include addressing Sunday crimes. The old distinction has no practical application in contemporary law enforcement, but the historical record of this strange exception remains, a reminder of how complicated jurisdictional and religious considerations once made straightforward questions of law remarkably convoluted. The image it creates is perfect. A criminal planning their heist and choosing Sunday for the legal protection, only to have someone point out that the bank is located next to the Ohio River, therefore canceling the Sunday exception. It's legal reasoning at its most Byzantine. And speaking of protecting animals from human entertainment, Oklahoma took a specific stand against a particularly cruel practice. Oklahoma's horse tripping ban. Oklahoma outlawed horse tripping events in 2007, making it illegal to organize, participate in, or attend rodeo events where horses are intentionally tripped for entertainment. This wasn't addressing accidental falls. This targeted a specific practice where riders would deliberately trip running horses using ropes, causing them to crash to the ground while spectators watched. Horse tripping, also called mangana or piales, in some regions, was practiced in certain rodeo circuits, particularly those with Mexican charreada traditions. The practice involved roping a horse's legs while it was running, yanking the rope tight, and causing the horse to fall. Spectators judged the skill of the roper and the dramatic nature of the fall. Horses frequently suffered serious injuries, from broken legs to internal trauma. Oklahoma's ban came after years of pressure from animal welfare organizations. Video footage of horse tripping events showed horses crashing violently to the ground, sometimes unable to stand afterward. Veterinary experts testified about the injuries caused by these practices. The evidence made clear that horse tripping wasn't harmless entertainment. It was animal cruelty dressed up as cultural tradition. The law makes it a misdemeanor to promote, engage in, or be a spectator at horse tripping events. Penalties include fines and potential jail time. Several other states passed similar bans around the same time, responding to the same animal welfare concerns. The practice continues in some locations without bans, but it's increasingly rare as cultural attitudes shift. Oklahoma's law recognized that tradition doesn't justify cruelty. Some practices from the past don't deserve preservation, especially when they cause unnecessary animal suffering. Horse tripping joined cockfighting, bear baiting, and other banned animal blood sports consigned to history where it belongs. And while Oklahoma protects horses, Oregon has some very specific rules about where you can and cannot hunt. Oregon's cemetery hunting ban. Oregon law explicitly prohibits hunting in cemeteries. This seems obvious, the kind of thing that shouldn't need to be written down, but Oregon revised statutes, section 166-645 makes it crystal clear. No hunting, fishing, or trapping in cemeteries. The statute exists because apparently enough people thought hunting in graveyards was acceptable that the state needed to specifically ban it. The reasoning is straightforward. Cemeteries are places of rest, mourning, and respect for the dead. They're not wildlife management areas or hunting grounds. Discharging firearms near grave sites, tracking game through burial plots, or treating cemeteries as hunting territory disrespects both the dead and the living people visiting them. The ban protects the sanctity of these spaces. But there's also a practical safety element. Cemeteries are often located near populated areas. Hunting in or near them creates serious safety risks. Stray bullets don't respect property boundaries. Wounded game fleeing through grave sites could endanger visitors. The combination of weapons, populated areas, and sacred ground creates unacceptable risk levels. The law includes exceptions for pest control when authorized by cemetery management. If a cemetery has a rodent problem or invasive species issue, licensed professionals can address it. But recreational hunting is absolutely prohibited. You cannot decide the cemetery is a good place to hunt deer, no matter how many deer you see there. Enforcement happens when needed. Police respond to reports of hunters in cemeteries, and violations can result in trespassing charges in addition to the specific cemetery hunting prohibition. The law draws a clear line. Cemeteries are for the dead and those who mourn them, not for hunting. And speaking of unusual fishing regulations, Pennsylvania has some very specific rules about acceptable fishing methods. Pennsylvania's mouth fishing ban. Pennsylvania's fishing regulations are extensive, covering acceptable hooks, bait types, seasonal limits, and catch sizes. Buried in those regulations is a provision that prohibits catching fish with your mouth, not with a rod while your mouth happens to be open, actually using your mouth as the catching mechanism. It's illegal, and Pennsylvania felt strongly enough about it to write it into law. This law likely addresses noodling, or hand fishing techniques, where people catch fish by grabbing them or using unconventional methods. Some practitioners of these techniques would actually bite fish to secure them, using teeth as a temporary holding mechanism while maneuvering the catch. Pennsylvania decided this crossed a line of acceptable fishing practice. The prohibition also addresses concerns about game fish populations and fair chase principles. Fishing regulations exist partly to ensure sustainable populations through limiting catch methods. Using your mouth to catch fish might be effective in certain situations, but it's not the kind of sporting method that aligns with conservation goals. The state wants fishing to involve skill and equipment, not desperation and teeth. There are also health and safety considerations. Fish carry bacteria and parasites. Biting a fish or putting your mouth near a fish you're catching creates disease transmission risks. Fish have sharp fins and can carry harmful microorganisms. Using your mouth in the catching process is asking for infections, injuries, or worse. The law is rarely enforced because mouth fishing is rare in Pennsylvania's regulated waters. Most people use conventional tackle, but the prohibition exists, specific and clear, ensuring that if someone does decide to try catching fish with their teeth, game wardens have legal grounds to intervene. And from Pennsylvania's fishing restrictions, we move to Rhode Island's surprisingly specific assault laws. Rhode Island's limb biting law, Rhode Island. Law specifically prohibits biting off someone's limb. This appears in the state's assault and battery statutes, making it a distinct criminal offense to use your teeth to remove someone's appendage. The specificity seems bizarre until you remember that assault laws need to cover all possible forms of violence, including the uncommon and disturbing ones. The provision exists within Rhode Island General Laws, Title 11, Chapter 9, which addresses assault and battery. While most assault involves fists, weapons, or other conventional violence, the law recognizes that attacks can take many forms. Biting is assault. Biting that removes a limb, digit, or other body part is aggravated assault with specific penalties. The law isn't targeting zombie attacks or vampire behavior. It emerged from real incidents where people bit others during fights, sometimes causing permanent disfigurement. Ears, fingers, and noses are particularly vulnerable to bite removal. These injuries are serious, causing permanent damage and often requiring complex medical treatment. The law ensures serious penalties for these particularly violent assaults. Rhode Island's specific mention of limb biting also serves a legal clarity purpose. Without explicit language, prosecutors might struggle to fit these cases into existing assault categories. By specifically naming the offense, the statute removes ambiguity. If you bite off someone's finger during a fight, there's no question about whether it constitutes aggravated assault. The law very rarely gets applied because limb removal biting is extremely uncommon. But when such incidents do occur, Rhode Island prosecutors have clear statutory language supporting serious charges. Its legal specificity taken to its logical extreme, addressing even the most unusual forms of violence to ensure justice can be served. And speaking of unusual prohibitions, South Carolina had a long-standing ban on a beloved arcade game, South Carolina's pinball age restriction. Until 2016, South Carolina prohibited minors from playing pinball machines. This wasn't a recent development. The ban had existed for decades, treating pinball as a form of gambling that needed to be restricted from children. Anyone under 18 caught playing pinball could theoretically face legal consequences, and establishments allowing underage pinball play risked fines or license revocations. The law emerged from mid-20th century concerns about pinball as gambling. Early pinball machines often paid out prizes or money for high scores. Making them gambling devices, Many jurisdictions banned or heavily regulated pinball in the 1930s and 40s. South Carolina's restriction was part of this broader anti-pinball movement, protecting youth from gambling's corrupting influence. By the time the law was repealed in 2016, pinball had long since evolved away from its gambling roots. Modern pinball machines are purely skill-based entertainment. They don't pay out money. They're no more gambling than video games. But South Carolina's law remained on the books, a forgotten relic from an earlier era's moral panic. The repeal came when a pinball enthusiast opened a museum and discovered that legally, children couldn't play the machines. He lobbied for law changes, pointing out the absurdity of restricting pinball while allowing minors to play video games, sports, and actual games of chance at arcades. The legislature agreed and quietly removed the restriction. For decades, South Carolina children missed out on a classic arcade experience because of an outdated law nobody remembered to repeal. It's a perfect example of how legislation can outlive its original purpose, sitting dormant in code books until someone finally notices and corrects the anachronism. And from arcade restrictions to food production rules, South Dakota has some very specific regulations about sleeping locations. South Dakota's cheese factory sleep ban. South Dakota law prohibits sleeping in cheese factories, not working in cheese factories, not visiting cheese factories, specifically sleeping overnight in facilities where cheese is produced. This regulation appears in South Dakota's health and safety codes related to food production facilities, and it exists for very good reasons that become obvious once you think about it. Cheese production requires strict sanitation. Bacteria control is essential. The same bacteria that ferment milk into delicious cheese can also cause serious illness if contamination occurs. Having people sleeping in production facilities increases contamination risks dramatically. Humans shed skin cells, carry bacteria, and create sanitation challenges even when they're just standing still. Sleeping in a cheese factory multiplies these issues. The regulation also addresses worker exploitation concerns. In industries with immigrant labor or low-wage workers, employers sometimes provide inadequate housing or expect workers to sleep at production facilities. Explicitly banning sleeping in cheese factories prevents this practice. Workers must have actual housing, separate from where they work and where food is produced. There's also the simple fact that cheese factories aren't designed as residential spaces. They lack proper sleeping facilities, adequate ventilation for overnight human occupation, and the amenities required for safe habitation. Using them as housing creates safety hazards beyond just sanitation concerns. Workers sleeping in production facilities face risks from machinery, chemicals, and the industrial environment. Is this law frequently enforced? Probably not, because most cheese producers follow basic sanitation standards that already prohibit sleeping in production areas, but the explicit prohibition exists, ensuring that if violations occur, inspectors and prosecutors have clear legal grounds for intervention. It's specific, practical, and surprisingly necessary regulation for South Dakota's dairy industry. And from food production laws, we jump to the digital age with Tennessee's controversial password sharing statute. Tennessee's Netflix password law. Tennessee made national headlines in 2011 when it became the first state to make sharing entertainment subscription passwords illegal. The law, passed as an amendment to existing theft of services statutes, criminalized sharing login credentials for services like Netflix, Hulu, or Spotify without the account holder's permission. Violating the law could result in misdemeanor or felony charges depending on the value of services accessed. The legislation was pushed by entertainment industry lobbying groups concerned about revenue losses from password sharing. They argued that when people share passwords with friends or family members not living in the same household, they're essentially stealing services that should be paid for. The industry wanted legal tools to address this behavior, and Tennessee provided them. The law sparked immediate controversy. Critics pointed out that many subscription services implicitly allowed some password sharing through family plan options or multiple simultaneous streams. Where was the line between acceptable sharing and criminal theft? The law's vagueness meant almost anyone sharing a Netflix password could technically be prosecuted, even though the behavior was widespread and generally accepted. Enforcement has been essentially non existent. Tennessee hasn't prosecuted individuals for sharing Netflix passwords. The law's real purpose was creating a legal framework that could be used in extreme cases or against commercial password sharing operations. It was more about establishing principle than actual enforcement. In 2023, Netflix and other services began cracking down on password sharing through technological means rather than legal action. They implemented household verification, limited simultaneous streams, and charged fees for additional users. Tennessee's law remained on the books, a strange artifact of early streaming era legal thinking that anticipated problems before fully understanding how to address them. And while Tennessee regulates digital sharing, Texas has some very specific prohibitions about human body parts. Texas's eyeball sales ban, Texas law explicitly prohibits the purchase or sale of human eyes or any portion of human eyes. This isn't about organ donation or medical transplants, which are carefully regulated through different statutes. This is specifically about commercial transactions involving eyeballs. You cannot buy or sell human eyes in Texas, period. The law exists in Texas Health and Safety Code Section 48.02. The prohibition addresses concerns about black market organ trade and exploitation. While organ donation for medical purposes is legal and regulated, commercial organ sales create opportunities for coercion and exploitation. People in desperate financial situations might sell body parts, or worse, might be victimized by those who forcibly take organs for profit. Texas's law aims to prevent these practices. The eyeball-specific language emerged from cases where corneas and other eye tissues were being bought and sold through questionable channels. Legitimate medical eye banks exist and operate legally, handling donated tissue for transplants, but commercial operations were emerging that didn't follow proper procedures, creating safety and ethical concerns. The explicit ban shut down these markets. Violations carry serious penalties. Buying or selling human eyeballs is a Class A misdemeanor in Texas, punishable by up to a year in jail and substantial fines. The law applies to eyes or eye parts from deceased or living persons, covering all possible scenarios where commercial eyeball transactions might occur. The specificity of mentioning eyeballs rather than just organs or body parts makes the law memorable and clear. There's no ambiguity. If it's a human eye or piece thereof, you cannot buy or sell it in Texas. The law protects human dignity and prevents exploitation, even if it requires stating the obvious in disturbingly specific terms. And from Texas's organ restrictions, Utah has some very particular rules about alcohol availability during crises. Utah's emergency alcohol ban. Utah law prohibits the sale of alcohol during declared states of emergency. When the governor declares an emergency, whether for natural disasters, civil unrest, or other crises, alcohol sales must immediately cease. Package stores close. Bars stop serving. Restaurants can't sell wine with dinner. The prohibition remains in effect until the emergency declaration ends. The law exists under Utah Code Section 32B, part of the state's comprehensive alcohol regulations. Utah has some of America's strictest alcohol laws, reflecting the state's significant Mormon population and cultural attitudes toward drinking. The emergency provision takes these restrictions further, viewing alcohol sales during crises as potentially dangerous. The reasoning combines public safety concerns with law enforcement efficiency. During emergencies, authorities worry about impaired people making bad decisions, alcohol-fueled unrest, or intoxicated individuals interfering with emergency response. Prohibiting sales theoretically reduces these risks by limiting alcohol availability when the state needs maximum public cooperation. The law has been invoked during major snowstorms, earthquakes, and civil disturbances. Each time, it generates controversy. Critics point out that people who want to drink during emergencies will simply stock up beforehand or find alcohol through other means. The ban doesn't eliminate drinking, it just inconveniences people and hurts businesses already suffering from the emergency itself. Supporters argue that even modest reductions in alcohol consumption during crises justify the policy. If the ban prevents even a few drunk driving accidents or alcohol-related incidents while emergency services are stretched thin, it's worthwhile. The debate reflects broader disagreements about alcohol regulation and government authority during emergencies. The result is that Utah residents experiencing emergencies must do so sober, at least officially. Whether the law achieves its goals or simply adds another layer of restriction to an already highly regulated market remains debatable. And from Utah's emergency restrictions, Vermont has its own story about requiring permission for personal decisions. Vermont's denture approval law. Vermont once required married women to obtain their husband's written permission before getting dentures. Stop and think about that for a moment. A woman could be sitting in a dentist's office, suffering from severe dental problems, checkbook in hand, ready to pay for false teeth that would dramatically improve her quality of life. But without a signed permission slip from her husband, the dentist couldn't legally provide the service. This wasn't some medieval holdover from the 1700s. This law existed on the books until the 1970s. The 1970s. The same decade that gave us disco, Watergate, and the moon landing also featured Vermont telling married women they needed spousal approval for basic dental care. The law emerged from broader legal principles about married women's property and contract rights, specifically coverture laws that persisted well into the 20th century. Under coverture, a married woman's legal identity was essentially absorbed into her husband's. She had limited ability to enter contracts, own property independently, or make significant purchases without spousal consent. Every major decision required male approval. Dentures were apparently considered significant enough to trigger this requirement, falling into the category of purchases that wives couldn't make autonomously. The practical impact was humiliating and controlling in ways that are hard to fully appreciate from a modern perspective. Consider the woman whose husband was deployed overseas, making permission impossible to obtain quickly, or the woman whose husband was simply uncooperative, refusing to sign off on medical treatments for reasons ranging from financial control to pure spite. Women whose husbands were absent, deliberately withholding approval, or simply indifferent had no legal recourse. A woman with severe dental problems that affected her ability to eat, speak, or function normally might suffer unnecessarily because her husband refused to sign a piece of paper. The law gave men absolute control over their wives' basic health decisions, treating adult women as children who couldn't be trusted to make choices about their own bodies. Vermont repealed this law as part of broader reforms in the 1970s that recognized married women as independent legal actors. The denture requirement disappeared along with other coverture remnants, swept away by silent wave feminism and changing legal attitudes about gender equality. New laws recognized women's autonomy in medical and financial decisions, treating marriage as a partnership between equals rather than a relationship of dependence and control. The law's existence seems shocking from a modern perspective, the kind of thing that makes you double-check the date to make sure you read it correctly. But it was part of a comprehensive legal framework that treated married women as dependents rather than equals. Vermont wasn't unique or even unusual. Many states had similar restrictions on married women's autonomy, covering everything from opening bank accounts to signing contracts to making medical decisions. The denture law just happened to be specific and memorable enough to survive in collective memory even after repeal. A perfect example of how recently women gained basic legal rights we now take for granted. And speaking of age-based restrictions that seem arbitrary and controlling, Virginia has some very specific rules about Halloween activities that treat teenagers like potential criminals. Virginia's trick-or-treating age limit, several cities in Virginia, including Chesapeake and Newport News, have ordinances prohibiting trick-or-treating for anyone age 14 or older. If you're in ninth grade or beyond, dressing up and going door to door for candy on Halloween is illegal, not discouraged, not frowned upon, actually illegal. Violations can result in misdemeanor charges, fines up to $100, or even jail time of up to 6 months, though actual enforcement focuses more on warnings than prosecution. But the threat exists, written into city code, creating a situation where a high school freshman wearing a costume and carrying a pillowcase could technically face criminal charges. The laws were passed in the late 1980s and early 1990s to address concerns about older teenagers using Halloween as cover for vandalism, harassment, or other problematic behavior. City officials argued that trick-or-treating should be for young children, and once kids reach high school age, they should find other ways to celebrate Halloween. The age restrictions aimed to reclaim Halloween as a family-friendly children's activity, pushing teenagers toward organized parties or other supervised celebrations instead of roaming neighborhoods after dark. Critics immediately pointed out the absurdity. 14-year-olds are still kids. They're barely into puberty, still dependent on their parents, still very much children in most meaningful ways. Many have developmental disabilities, social anxiety, or other reasons for wanting to participate in traditional Halloween activities beyond elementary school age. The laws potentially criminalize harmless fun, turning teenagers who just want candy into lawbreakers. Some families have children of different ages who want to trick or treat together. Should the older siblings stay home while the younger ones go out? Should parents split up to accommodate an arbitrary age cutoff? The ordinances also include time restrictions, typically requiring trick-or-treating to end by 8 p.m. Combined with age limits, these rules create a very specific, highly regulated Halloween experience. Virginia's affected cities envision Halloween as a brief, early evening activity for elementary school children only, with teenagers and adults excluded entirely. The regulations treat Halloween like it's a municipal service, with strict operating hours rather than a cultural tradition that communities celebrate organically. Enforcement discretion means most teens trick-or-treating face no consequences. Police generally don't arrest teenagers for wearing costumes unless they're causing actual problems, but the threat exists and some teens have been questioned or warned by police for the crime of being 14 and wanting candy. The laws create anxiety for parents who aren't sure if their 8th or ninth grader will face legal consequences for participating in a tradition they've enjoyed their entire childhood. National attention to these laws has been mostly mockery. Late-night comedians joke about it. Social media regularly rediscovers the ordinances with fresh outrage. The idea of arresting teenagers for trick-or-treating seems like parody, something from a dystopian satire about over-regulated society. But the ordinances are real and technically enforceable. Virginia's Halloween laws represent government regulation at its most micromanaging, attempting to legislate exact parameters for a cultural tradition that varies naturally by family, neighborhood, and personal preference. And from Virginia's Halloween rules, Washington state takes things in an even stranger direction with cryptozoological protection laws that defend creatures that probably don't exist. Washington's Bigfoot protection law, Skamania County, Washington, has a law making it illegal to kill Bigfoot. The ordinance, passed in 1969 and updated in 1984, declares Bigfoot an endangered species and prohibits hunting, killing, or harassing the creature. Violations can result in substantial fines and potential jail time. The law treats Bigfoot as real, protected wildlife, despite no scientific evidence that the species exists. Read that again slowly. A county government passed legislation protecting an animal that has never been proven to exist. creating legal penalties for killing a cryptid that may be entirely mythological. The ordinance was partially a publicity stunt, and it worked brilliantly. Skamania County sits in prime Bigfoot country, nestled in the Cascade Mountains where numerous reported sightings have occurred over decades. The area has strong local cryptozoology culture, with believers, researchers, and enthusiasts regularly exploring the forests in search of evidence. Making Bigfoot hunting illegal generated immediate media attention, drew curious tourists, and established the county's identity as serious about Sasquatch protection. It was economic development through legal oddity, turning a strange law into a tourism magnet. But there's also a genuine conservation message buried in the absurdity. The law's supporters argued that whether Bigfoot exists or not, shooting at large, bipedal creatures in the forest is inherently dangerous. If someone thinks they see Bigfoot and opens fire, they might hit a hiker in a costume, a bear standing on hind legs, or another hunter moving through the underbrush. The law discourages this behavior by making it specifically illegal to target Bigfoot, creating a legal framework that protects both hypothetical cryptids and very real humans who might be mistaken for them. The 1969 original ordinance made Bigfoot hunting a misdemeanor. The 1984 update increased penalties significantly, making Bigfoot killing a felony with up to 5 years in prison and $10,000 fines. The escalation reflected both growing tourism around Bigfoot and increasing concern about people taking guns into the forest specifically to hunt cryptids. By the 80s, Bigfoot hunting expeditions were becoming more common, with armed groups heading into the wilderness specifically hoping to shoot a Sasquatch. Skamania County decided this needed stronger deterrence. Has anyone been prosecuted under this law? No, because no one has produced a Bigfoot corpse. The law remains theoretically enforceable, but practically untested. If someone did shoot something they claimed was Bigfoot, they'd face an interesting legal situation. Proving the creature was Bigfoot would require proving Bigfoot exists, which would be the scientific discovery of the century. Failing to prove it was Bigfoot might mean they shot something else, possibly creating different legal problems. The law remains on the books decades later, protecting a creature that may not exist from hunters who definitely do. It's wonderfully absurd, perfectly Pacific Northwest, in its blend of environmental concern and cryptozoology enthusiasm, and surprisingly thoughtful about wildlife protection, even for wildlife that probably isn't real. Skamania County took an imaginary animal seriously enough to make killing it a felony, and somehow that feels exactly right for the region. And while Washington protects mythical creatures from harm, West Virginia has surprisingly permissive laws about roadside cuisine that some might consider equally strange. West Virginia's roadkill legalization. West Virginia legalized eating roadkill in 2016, making it one of the first states to explicitly permit harvesting animals killed by vehicles for human consumption. If you hit a deer with your car, or you find a freshly killed deer on the roadside, you can legally take it home and eat it. The law requires reporting the harvest and following basic safety guidelines, but roadkill consumption is officially permitted, regulated, and even encouraged as a practical use of meat that would otherwise waste. The legislation addressed a long-standing practice that existed in legal gray area for generations. Rural West Virginians had been eating roadkill long before 2016, viewing it as common sense use of available resources. Deer are plentiful in West Virginia. Vehicle strikes are extremely common, particularly during rutting season when deer are more active and less cautious. Taking home fresh roadkill made economic and environmental sense. A deer killed by vehicle impact is often perfectly good meat, no different from a deer killed by hunting. Letting it rot on the roadside seemed wasteful when families could use the protein, but technically, taking roadkill violated game laws about possession of wildlife outside hunting seasons. People doing it risked citations, fines, or even losing hunting privileges if caught with out-of-season deer they couldn't prove came from roadside accidents. The legal ambiguity created situations where people who'd accidentally hit deer would leave them rather than face potential legal problems from harvesting the meat. Conservation officers generally looked the other way for obvious roadkill situations, but the practice existed in legal limbo. The 2016 law created a formal framework that legitimized the practice. Drivers who hit animals can claim them by reporting to the Division of Natural Resources within 12 hours. People who find fresh roadkill can claim it through the same process. The law includes common sense restrictions. The animal must be recently killed, not diseased or decomposed, and safe for consumption. You can't claim something that's been decaying for days, and certain species remain prohibited even as roadkill. The reporting requirement helps wildlife officials track vehicle collision data, providing valuable information about deer populations and high-risk road areas. Other states have since followed West Virginia's lead, recognizing that roadkill laws serve multiple practical purposes. They reduce waste by allowing edible meat to be used, rather than left to rot. They provide food for people who want it, particularly rural families who rely on hunting and wild game for significant portions of their protein. They acknowledge and legitimize cultural practices that have existed for generations, and they help with carcass removal, as people claiming roadkill take care of disposal themselves rather than requiring state highway crews to clean up. West Virginia's roadkill law sparked national media attention and plenty of jokes about hillbilly stereotypes. Late-night comedians made the obvious mockery. Urban audiences found the whole concept simultaneously disgusting and fascinating. But for West Virginia residents, particularly those in rural areas, it was practical legislation addressing a real situation that occurs daily. The state has deer, the state has cars. Sometimes they collide violently. Making use of the resulting meat makes sense economically, environmentally, and culturally. Now it's explicitly legal, properly regulated, and honestly more sensible than many laws we've discussed. And from West Virginia's practical approach to unexpected food sources, Wisconsin has its own story about dairy protectionism so extreme it banned an entire product category for decades. Wisconsin's margarine battle. Wisconsin banned margarine from restaurants and public institutions until 1967. Not just restricted it, not just discouraged its use, but completely banned it from any establishment serving food to the public. Restaurants couldn't serve it with bread. Schools couldn't use it in cafeteria cooking. Hospitals couldn't spread it on patient toast. If you wanted margarine in Wisconsin, you had to buy it at a store and use it at home, hidden from public view like some kind of dairy contraband. Public establishments were butter-only zones, and the state enforced this rule vigorously for decades. The ban existed purely to protect Wisconsin's massive dairy industry from cheaper competition. As America's dairyland, Wisconsin produced enormous quantities of butter. The state's economy depended heavily on dairy farming. Margarine threatened that market by offering a butter alternative at a fraction of the price. Dairy farmers and their powerful lobbying organizations saw margarine as an existential threat to their livelihoods. They lobbied intensively for protective legislation, and Wisconsin's government delivered exactly what they wanted. The ban was pure economic protectionism, using law to eliminate market competition rather than competing on quality or price. Wisconsin took the anti-margarine crusade further than most states, and that's saying something because many states had margarine restrictions. Even when margarine was allowed for home purchase, Wisconsin required it to be sold uncolored, forcing margarine to look unappetizing. Margarine naturally looks white or pale, distinctly different from butter's yellow color. Manufacturers wanted to add yellow dye to make margarine look more like butter, improving its visual appeal. Wisconsin prohibited this, forcing margarine to remain white and unappetizing, practically shouting, "This is not real butter," from the package. The color restriction created a bizarre workaround industry. Some margarine packages included a separate color packet that consumers could mix in at home. a capsule of yellow dye that you'd break and knead into the margarine until it reached butter-like coloration. This complied with the letter of the law while allowing consumers to have yellow margarine if they were willing to work for it. The process took effort and time, which was exactly the point. Wisconsin wanted buying margarine to be inconvenient, unpleasant, and clearly inferior to buying butter. The bans gradually crumbled under federal pressure and changing consumer preferences. The restaurant ban fell in 1967, the same year the color restriction finally ended. Wisconsin dairy farmers fought these changes every step of the way, arguing that removing protections would destroy their industry. They predicted economic disaster, farm foreclosures, and the end of Wisconsin dairy culture. In reality, Wisconsin's dairy industry adapted and survived, though not without significant consolidation and change. The margarine wars demonstrate how far agricultural states would go to protect their dominant industries. Wisconsin loved its dairy farmers enough to ban competing products entirely, creating a butter monopoly through legislation rather than market competition. The protectionism worked for decades, keeping margarine out of public view and maintaining butter's dominance, before finally yielding to broader market forces and federal commerce regulations. And finally, we reach Wyoming, where the last strange law on our list reminds us that sometimes legislation exists simply because certain behaviors are too important to leave to chance. Wyoming's gate closing requirement. Wyoming law requires anyone who opens a gate on someone else's property to close it behind them. This applies to everyone, no exceptions. Hunters crossing ranches, hikers on trails, drivers taking shortcuts, anyone passing through property lines. Open a gate, walk through or drive through, close the gate. The rule is absolute and universally understood. Failure to do so can result in fines, legal liability if livestock escape, or property damage occurs, and serious social consequences in communities where reputation matters. The law is actively enforced and taken seriously throughout the state, part of the basic code of conduct that governs rural Wyoming life. The regulation exists because Wyoming is ranch country, vast open spaces where livestock operations depend on functional fencing and properly closed gates. Gates aren't decorative. They serve essential functions, keeping livestock contained within designated pastures, separating different herds to prevent breeding chaos, maintaining property boundaries in areas where fence lines stretch for miles, and controlling animal movement between seasonal grazing areas. An open gate can lead to cattle escaping, mixing with other herds and creating genetic and ownership confusion, wandering onto highways where they cause accidents, or getting lost in vast open ranges where recovering them becomes nearly impossible. Recovering scattered cattle costs time, money, and enormous effort. A rancher might spend days tracking down animals that escape through an open gate, riding across thousands of acres, negotiating with neighbors whose land the cattle wandered onto, and hoping the animals didn't end up injured or dead. In winter, escaped cattle can freeze. In summer, they can become dehydrated far from water sources. A single person's carelessness can create disasters for ranchers whose livelihoods depend on keeping their herds secure. Wyoming statutes, Section 6-3-104, specifically addresses criminal mischief related to gates and fences. While not exclusively about leaving gates open, the law makes clear that interfering with ranchers' fencing and gates carries penalties. Combined with civil liability for damages caused by open gates, the legal framework strongly encourages gate-closing behavior. If your failure to close a gate results in cattle escaping and being hit by vehicles, you can be held liable for the value of the animals, property damage to vehicles, and any injuries to people involved. Enforcement happens both officially and unofficially. Police can cite people for leaving gates open, particularly if livestock escape and cause problems. But more commonly, ranchers themselves confront violators, often quite directly and memorably. In rural Wyoming, leaving a gate open marks you as either ignorant or disrespectful, both serious offenses in ranch culture. You might get a stern lecture. You might get escorted off the property with clear instructions never to return. In extreme cases, you might find your vehicle blocked in until you go back and close the gate properly. The social enforcement is often stronger and more immediate than legal penalties. The gate law represents a broader principle that governs Wyoming life. You respect the land and the people who work it. You don't leave gates open. You don't litter. You don't damage property. You don't create problems for others through carelessness. These aren't suggestions or guidelines. They're requirements backed by law and enforced by a culture that values responsibility, community consideration, and basic competence. Close the gate. It's that simple. And that brings us to the end of our journey through America's strangest legal landscape. From fake mustaches in Alabama churches to gate closing requirements in Wyoming, from pickle bounce tests in Connecticut to Bigfoot protection in Washington, we've covered a lot of strange ground. 50 laws that prove beyond doubt that somewhere, at some point, someone thought these things were serious enough problems to require legislation. Some of these laws made sense once, shaped by eras when fake mustaches really were used for mocking congregations, when margarine threatened entire state economies, and when people apparently needed explicit instructions not to hunt in cemeteries. Others never made much sense at all, born from moral panics, industry lobbying, or just the sheer creativity of legislators with too much time and not enough actual problems to solve. The beautiful thing is that most of these laws sit quietly in dusty codebooks, forgotten by everyone except the people who compile weird law lists and make documentaries for people trying to fall asleep. They're not enforced, they're not relevant. They're just there, legal fossils from stranger times, proof that America has always been exactly this weird. So tonight, as you drift off, be grateful. Be grateful you're not a 14-year-old trying to trick-or-treat in Virginia. Be grateful you're not trying to eat fried chicken with a fork in Gainesville, Georgia. Be grateful you're not an unmarried woman attempting to parachute in Florida on a Sunday. And be especially grateful that you've never had to explain to a police officer why there's a donkey sleeping in your bathtub. America, where freedom means we're free to pass the strangest laws imaginable. Sleep tight, and for the love of everything holy, remember to close the gate.